The galaxy had always been a vast and mysterious expanse, filled with countless worlds and civilizations, each with its own history, culture, and technology. Yet, despite its infinite variety, there was one truth that bound all sentient beings together: fear. Fear of the unknown, fear of death, fear of the darkness that lurked at the edges of space. It was this fear that had driven many to band together in the Galactic Council, a coalition of the most advanced and powerful species, dedicated to maintaining peace and order in the galaxy. But even the Council, with all its might and wisdom, was not immune to the terror that gripped the galaxy when the Devourers arrived. The Devourers were unlike any enemy the galaxy had ever faced. They came from beyond the known universe, from a place where the very fabric of reality seemed to bend and twist according to their will. Their ships were vast and organic, pulsating with a sickly, unnatural light that filled those who saw it with an overwhelming sense of dread. But it was not their ships that truly terrified the galaxy, it was their weapons. The Devourers wielded technology that defied all understanding, weapons that could tear apart the minds of their enemies, reducing them to babbling, broken shells of their former selves. Whole planets fell before their onslaught. Their populations driven mad by the Devourers' psychic assaults, their civilizations crumbling into chaos and ruin. The Galactic Council, in all its wisdom, had no answer to the Devourers. Their fleets were torn apart, their soldiers driven to madness, their leaders left helpless in the face of this new and terrifying threat. It was as if the galaxy itself was unraveling, its once orderly and predictable nature being consumed by the chaos and madness that the Devourers brought with them. And so, one by one, the members of the Council began to fall, their worlds consumed by the growing darkness, their people left to cower in fear and despair. But there was one species that refused to bow before the Devourers, one race that stood defiant in the face of this cosmic terror: humanity. Humanity had always been an outlier in the galaxy, a species that was both feared and respected for its tenacity and resilience. While other species had long since reached their peak, content to rest on their laurels and enjoy the fruits of their advanced technology, humanity had continued to push the boundaries of what was possible. They were explorers, innovators, and warriors, always striving to reach new heights, to conquer new challenges, and to overcome any obstacle that stood in their way. When the Devourers first appeared, humanity had been cautious. They watched from the sidelines as the Galactic Council's fleets were torn apart, as world after world fell to the invaders. But as the darkness spread and the Council's defeat seemed all but certain, humanity knew that they could no longer remain on the sidelines. They knew that if the Devourers were not stopped, it would only be a matter of time before Earth itself was consumed by the growing darkness. And so, humanity made a decision that would change the course of galactic history. They would fight. Captain Jordan Harris was one of the best that humanity had to offer. A veteran of countless battles, he had earned a reputation as a fearless leader and a brilliant strategist. When the call came to confront the Devourers, Harris was one of the first to volunteer. He knew the risks, knew that they were facing an enemy unlike any they had ever encountered, but he also knew that humanity could not afford to back down. This was their chance to prove their worth, to show the galaxy that they were not to be underestimated. The USS Endeavour, the flagship of humanity's fleet, was a marvel of engineering. Armed with the latest in human technology, it was a ship designed for one purpose: to win battles. Its hull was a sleek dark gray, bristling with weapons and shield generators. Inside, it was a hive of activity, with crew members rushing to their stations, preparing for the battle to come. Harris stood on the bridge, his hands clasped behind his back as he watched the stars streak by on the view screen. They were on their way to the Jem'Hadar colony, one of the last remaining strongholds in the sector, and one that was under siege by the Devourers. The distress call had come through only hours before, a frantic message from the Jem'Hadar delegate, Xenos, begging for human aid. The Jem'Hadar were a proud and powerful species, known for their warrior culture and their unbreakable resolve. For them to call for help was a sign of just how desperate the situation had become. Harris knew that they had no time to waste. The Devourers were relentless, and if they did not arrive in time, the colony would be lost. As the Endeavor dropped out of warp, the sight that greeted them was one of utter devastation. The once thriving colony was in ruins, its cities reduced to twisted, nightmarish shapes. Fires raged unchecked, casting an eerie glow over the landscape. The air was thick with smoke and the stench of burning flesh. But what struck Harris the most was the silence. There was no sound of battle, no screams of the dying, only an oppressive, suffocating silence that seemed to press down on them from all sides. "Captain, we're picking up life signs," the sensor officer reported, breaking the silence. "There are still survivors down there." Harris nodded. "Prepare a landing party. We're going down." The landing party, led by Harris himself, descended to the surface in a shuttlecraft. As they stepped out onto the shattered remains of the colony, they were met by a group of survivors. Their faces were gaunt and hollow, their eyes wide with terror. They huddled together, clutching makeshift weapons, their bodies trembling with fear. "Who are you?" one of them asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Captain Jordan Harris, of the USS Endeavor," Harris replied. "We're here to help." The man stared at him for a moment, as if trying to process the words. Then slowly he nodded. "Thank the stars," he muttered. We thought we were the last ones left. What happened here?" Harris asked, though he already knew the answer. "They came out of nowhere," the man said, his voice shaking. "One minute, everything was normal, and the next, they were here. They tore through our defenses like they were nothing. The soldiers, they didn't stand a chance. And then the screaming started." Harris frowned. "Screaming?" The man nodded, his eyes wide with fear. "The Devourers, they didn't just kill us. They got inside our heads. We heard voices, whispers, terrible things. They made us see things that weren't real. It was like they were trying to drive us mad." Harris exchanged a grim look with his first officer. This was worse than they had feared. The Devourers were not just a physical threat, they were a psychological one as well. They were using some kind of psychic weapon to break their enemies' minds before finishing them off. "Get these people back to the ship," Harris ordered, "and prepare for an assault. We're going to find these bastards and put an end to this." The survivors were quickly evacuated back to the Endeavor, and the landing party moved out, following the trail of destruction left by the Devourers. It didn't take long to find them. The Devourer forces were gathered in the remains of what had once been the colony's central plaza, their twisted organic ships hovering ominously overhead. "Captain, we've got movement," one of the soldiers reported. "They've spotted us. Hold your fire," Harris ordered. "Let's see what they do." The Devourers did not charge or open fire as Harris had expected. Instead, they simply stood there, watching. Harris felt a chill run down his spine as he realized that they were not looking at the soldiers, but at him. He could feel their eyes boring into him, cold and unfeeling, as if they were staring straight into his soul. "Captain," the first officer began, but Harris held up a hand to silence him. "Steady," Harris said, his voice calm and steady. "Wait for my command." The seconds ticked by, each one stretching out into an eternity. Harris could feel the tension in the air, thick and heavy, like the calm before a storm. And then, without warning, the Devourers attacked. They moved with inhuman speed, their limbs a blur as they charged towards the human soldiers. Harris barely had time to react before they were upon them, their weapons flashing in the dim light. The battle was fierce and chaotic, with soldiers fighting for their lives against an enemy that seemed unstoppable. But Harris had faced impossible odds before, and he knew that victory was not always a matter of strength or numbers. It was about willpower, about the ability to keep fighting even when everything seemed lost. And so, he fought, his every movement precise and controlled, his mind focused on one thing: survival. The Devourers were relentless, but so was Harris. He moved through their ranks like a force of nature, cutting down one enemy after another with cold, calculated efficiency. But even as he fought, he could feel the Devourers' psychic attacks trying to worm their way into his mind, whispering dark thoughts and fears, trying to break his resolve. But Harris was not so easily broken. He pushed back against the voices, drowning them out with the sound of his own heartbeat, the rhythm of his breathing, the focus of his mind. He would not give in to fear, not now, not ever. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the battle was over. The last of the devourers fell to the ground, their bodies dissolving into a dark, oily substance that quickly evaporated into the air. Harris stood in the middle of the plaza, his chest heaving with exertion, his body covered in cuts and bruises, but still standing. "Captain, are you all right?" the first officer asked, hurrying to his side. "I'm fine," Harris replied, though he wasn't sure if it was true. The battle had taken a toll on him, both physically and mentally, but he couldn't afford to show weakness. Not now, not when there was still so much at stake. "Sir, we've got a problem," the communications officer reported, his voice tinged with urgency. "We're picking up a massive energy signature heading our way. It's the Devourer's main ship." Harris frowned. "How long do we have?" 5 minutes? Maybe less," the officer replied. "It's coming in fast." Harris nodded. "Get everyone back to the ship. We need to be ready for whatever comes next." The landing party quickly made their way back to the shuttlecraft, taking off just as the first signs of the Devourer's ship appeared on the horizon. The Endeavor's sensors picked up the massive vessel as it entered the atmosphere, its organic hull glowing with a sickly green light. "Captain, the ship's on an intercept course with us," the tactical officer reported. "They're powering up their weapons. Evasive maneuvers," Harris ordered. "Prepare to return fire." The Endeavor's engines roared to life as the ship veered off its current course, narrowly avoiding the first barrage of energy blasts from the Devourer ship. The tactical officer quickly locked onto the enemy vessel, returning fire with the ship's main cannons. But the Devourer ship was unlike anything they had ever faced before. Its hull absorbed the energy blasts, dissipating them harmlessly into the atmosphere. The ship seemed almost alive, its surface shifting and changing as it adapted to the Endeavor's attacks. "Captain, our weapons are having no effect," the tactical officer said, his voice filled with frustration. "Keep firing," Harris ordered. "There has to be a weakness somewhere." The Endeavor continued to fire on the Devourer ship, but it was clear that they were outmatched. The enemy vessel was too fast, too powerful, and too well shielded for their weapons to penetrate. Harris knew that they couldn't keep this up for long. Eventually, the Devourers would overwhelm them. "Captain, they're charging up for another attack," the tactical officer warned. "We're running out of options." Harris clenched his fists, his mind racing as he tried to come up with a plan. They needed to do something, anything, to turn the tide of this battle. But what? What could they possibly do against an enemy that seemed invincible? And then, in the midst of his desperation, an idea came to him. It was risky, almost suicidal, but it might just be their only chance. "Helm, set a collision course with the Devourer ship," Harris ordered, his voice cold and determined. The bridge crew stared at him in shock, unable to believe what they had just heard. "Captain, are you serious?" the first officer asked, his voice filled with disbelief. "Do it," Harris said, his eyes locked on the view screen. "It's the only way." The helmsman hesitated for a moment, then nodded and input the coordinates. The Endeavor's engines roared to life, propelling the ship towards the Devourer vessel at breakneck speed. "Brace for impact," Harris ordered, gripping the armrests of his chair as the ship hurtled towards its target. The moments before the collision seemed to stretch into eternity. Harris could see the Devourer ship growing larger and larger on the view screen, its twisted, organic surface looming ominously before them. There was no turning back now. They were committed to this course, and whatever happened next would determine the fate of the entire galaxy. The impact was violent, shaking the entire ship as it slammed into the Devourer vessel. The force of the collision sent both ships spinning out of control, their hulls twisting and tearing as they were ripped apart by the sheer force of the impact. Harris was thrown from his chair, crashing to the floor as the ship's systems shorted out around him. Sparks flew from the consoles, and the lights flickered and died, plunging the bridge into darkness. For a moment there was nothing but silence, the only sound the faint hum of the emergency power systems kicking in. Harris slowly pushed himself to his feet, his body aching from the impact. He could feel blood trickling down the side of his face, but he ignored it, his mind focused on one thing: survival. "Is everyone all right?" Harris called out, his voice echoing in the darkness. There was a chorus of groans and coughs as the crew slowly began to recover from the impact. Harris could see the faint outlines of his officers moving in the dim light, their faces pale and drawn, but alive. "We're still here, Captain," the first officer replied, his voice filled with relief. "But the ship's taken heavy damage. We've lost primary power and our shields are down." "What about the Devourer ship?" Harris asked, his eyes scanning the view screen for any sign of the enemy vessel. The tactical officer checked his console, his fingers flying across the controls. It's gone, sir. We destroyed it." Harris let out a sigh of relief, his body sagging with exhaustion. They had done it. They had destroyed the Devourer ship, and with it, the threat that had loomed over the galaxy. But even as the relief washed over him, Harris knew that this was only the beginning. The Devourers were far from defeated, and there would be more battles to come. "Get us out of here," Harris ordered, his voice steady despite the exhaustion that threatened to overwhelm him. "We need to regroup and figure out our next move." The Endeavor's engines sputtered to life, propelling the ship away from the wreckage of the Devourer vessel. Harris watched as the stars streaked by on the view screen, his mind already racing with plans and strategies for the battles that lay ahead. They had won this battle, but the war was far from over. The Devourers were still out there, and they would stop at nothing to consume the entire galaxy. But Harris knew that humanity would not back down. They would fight, and they would keep fighting, no matter the cost. Because that was what it meant to be human. To stand defiant in the face of overwhelming odds, to refuse to be broken, to fight for the future of their species and their galaxy. And as long as there was breath in his body, Captain Jordan Harris would keep fighting, until the Devourers were nothing more than a distant memory, a dark chapter in the history of the galaxy that had been overcome by the indomitable spirit of humanity. As the Endeavor limped back to the nearest friendly outpost, the crew began the arduous task of repairing the ship and tending to the wounded. Harris spent hours poring over reports, analyzing the data they had gathered during the battle, and trying to piece together a strategy for the battles that were sure to come. The Devourers were a new and terrifying enemy, one that defied conventional tactics and logic. But Harris knew that they had weaknesses, and he was determined to find them. Days turned into weeks as the Endeavor and the rest of the human fleet regrouped and resupplied. Harris pushed his crew to their limits, drilling them relentlessly, refining their tactics, and preparing them for the next encounter with the Devourers. He knew that they couldn't afford to be caught off guard again. The fate of the galaxy depended on their ability to adapt and overcome. And then, the call came. The Devourers had launched a massive offensive, targeting key systems across the galaxy in a bid to break the remaining resistance and plunge the galaxy into darkness. The human fleet was the last line of defense, and it was up to Harris and his crew to hold the line. The battle that followed was one of the most brutal and desperate that Harris had ever fought. The Devourers threw everything they had at the human fleet, wave after wave of ships and psychic assaults designed to break their minds and crush their spirits. But Harris and his crew stood firm, their resolve unshaken even in the face of overwhelming odds. The fighting was intense, with ships clashing at close quarters, their weapons blazing in the darkness of space. Harris directed his forces with precision and skill, using every trick and tactic he had learned over his long career. The Devourers were relentless, their ships seemingly endless, but Harris knew that they couldn't keep this up forever. Every ship they destroyed, every Devourer they killed, was one less threat to the galaxy. And then, finally, the tide began to turn. The human fleet, battered and bloodied, began to push the Devourers back. The enemy ships, once so unstoppable, began to falter under the relentless assault. Harris could see the end in sight, the moment when they would finally drive the Devourers from their galaxy once and for all. But just as victory seemed within reach, the Devourers unleashed their final weapon, a massive, planet-sized ship that dwarfed even the largest of the human vessels. It was a behemoth, a monstrosity of twisted metal and organic matter, its surface bristling with weapons and shield generators. And at its heart, Harris knew, was the key to the Devourer's power. The Devourer mothership was a force of nature, its weapons capable of tearing apart entire fleets with a single blast. The human ships that had survived the initial assault were quickly overwhelmed, their hulls disintegrating under the relentless firepower of the enemy vessel. Harris knew that they were out of options. The only chance they had was to take the fight to the heart of the enemy, to destroy the mothership from within. Harris quickly formulated a plan, one that would require every ounce of courage and determination that his crew could muster. They would board the Devourer mothership, fight their way to the core, and plant a bomb that would destroy the ship and hopefully end the Devourer threat once and for all. The plan was risky, almost suicidal, but Harris knew that they had no other choice. If they failed, the Devourers would consume the entire galaxy, and there would be nothing left to stop them. Harris assembled a team of his best soldiers, veterans of countless battles, each one ready to lay down their life for the future of humanity. They boarded a shuttlecraft, and with the rest of the fleet providing cover, they launched towards the heart of the Devourer mothership. The shuttle's journey through the enemy's defenses was harrowing, with Devourer ships and weapons systems firing on them from all directions. But Harris's team was skilled and determined, and with a combination of luck and skill, they managed to breach the hull of the mothership and make their way inside. The interior of the Devourer ship was like nothing they had ever seen before. The walls seemed to pulse with a sickly organic light, and the air was thick with the stench of decay. The ship was alive, its twisted corridors and chambers filled with a sense of malevolence that sent chills down their spines. But there was no time for hesitation. Harris led his team deeper into the ship, following the readings from their scanners towards the core. The ship's defenses were relentless, with Devourer soldiers and automated weapon systems attacking them at every turn. But Harris and his team fought with everything they had, their weapons blazing as they cut their way through the enemy forces. Finally, they reached the core, a massive, pulsating sphere of energy that was the heart of the Devourer mothership. Harris could feel the power radiating from it, a malevolent force that threatened to overwhelm his senses, but he pushed through the fear, focusing on the task at hand. "Set the charges," Harris ordered, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. "We don't have much time." The team quickly planted the explosives around the core, their hands moving with practiced precision. The Devourers were closing in, their numbers overwhelming, but Harris and his team held the line, fighting off wave after wave of enemy soldiers. "Charges are set," one of the soldiers reported, his voice filled with tension. "We need to get out of here." Harris nodded. "Fall back to the shuttle. We're getting out of here." The team began their retreat, fighting their way back through the twisted corridors of the Devourer ship. The enemy forces were relentless, but Harris and his team were determined to make it out alive. They knew that their mission was the only hope for the galaxy, and they would not fail. As they reached the shuttle, Harris activated the detonator. The charges around the core exploded in a blinding flash of light, the shockwave tearing through the ship's interior. The mothership began to shake violently, its structure collapsing as the core was destroyed. "Get us out of here!" Harris shouted, as the shuttle's engines roared to life. The shuttle shot out of the collapsing ship, weaving through the debris and enemy fire as they made their escape. Behind them, the Devourer mothership began to implode, its massive bulk folding in on itself as the core's destruction triggered a chain reaction. The human fleet watched in awe as the Devourer ship was consumed by its own power, the massive vessel disintegrating into nothingness. The remaining Devourer forces, their leader and their strongest weapon destroyed, began to retreat, their ships fleeing the battlefield in disarray. The galaxy had been saved, but at a terrible cost. The human fleet was in shambles, their ships battered and broken, their crews exhausted and wounded. But they had won. They had faced the greatest threat the galaxy had ever known, and they had emerged victorious. Harris stood on the bridge of the Endeavor, watching the last of the Devourer ships vanish into the void. He knew that this was not the end. The Devourers were still out there, and they would return. But for now, they had bought the galaxy time to rebuild, to prepare, and to find a way to finally defeat the Devourers once and for all. As the Endeavor and the rest of the fleet began their journey back to Earth, Harris allowed himself a moment of reflection. They had faced impossible odds, and they had triumphed. But the cost had been high, and the war was far from over. But Harris knew that humanity would not back down. They would continue to fight, to adapt, and to overcome, because that was what it meant to be human, to stand firm in the face of overwhelming darkness, to refuse to be broken, to fight for a future that was worth living for. And as long as there was breath in his body, Captain Jordan Harris would keep fighting, until the Devourers were nothing more than a distant memory, a dark chapter in the history of the galaxy that had been overcome by the indomitable spirit of humanity. The future was uncertain, the road ahead fraught with danger. But Harris knew one thing for sure: humanity would never surrender. They would fight, they would endure, and they would prevail. The journey back to Earth was long and grueling. The fleet limped home, their ships battered and their crews exhausted. But there was a sense of relief, a sense of victory that permeated the air. They had faced the greatest threat the galaxy had ever known, and they had emerged victorious. But even as they celebrated their hard-won victory, there was a sense of unease that lingered in the back of their minds. The Devourers were still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for their next opportunity to strike. Harris knew that they could not afford to rest on their laurels. They had to be ready for whatever came next. As the Endeavor entered Earth's orbit, Harris stood on the bridge, his eyes fixed on the blue and green orb below. It was a sight that he had seen countless times before, but it never failed to fill him with a sense of awe and wonder. Earth was home, the cradle of humanity, and it was worth fighting for. But as he looked down at the planet, he couldn't help but feel a sense of foreboding. The Devourers were not defeated, not yet. They had been dealt a heavy blow, but they would return, stronger and more determined than ever. And when they did, humanity had to be ready. The Endeavor touched down at the spaceport, and the crew disembarked, greeted by a crowd of cheering civilians and military personnel. Harris was met by Admiral Graves, the commander of Earth's defense forces, who clasped his hand in a firm handshake. "Well done, Captain," Graves said, his voice filled with genuine admiration. "You and your crew have done humanity proud." "Thank you, sir," Harris replied, though there was a note of weariness in his voice. "But this isn't over. The Devourers are still out there, and they'll be back." Graves nodded, his expression somber. "I know. That's why we've been working on something. Something that might just give us the edge we need." Harris raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What is it?" Graves gestured for Harris to follow him, and they made their way to a secure briefing room deep within the spaceport. Inside, a group of scientists and engineers were gathered around a large table, covered with blueprints and data readouts. "This," Graves said, pointing to the blueprints, "is Project Sentinel. It's a new class of warship, one that we've been developing in secret for the past few years. It's designed specifically to counter the Devourer threat." Harris leaned in, studying the blueprints with interest. The design was unlike anything he had ever seen before. The ship was sleek and angular, with a hull made of an advanced alloy that was both lightweight and incredibly strong. It was armed to the teeth, with a variety of experimental weapon systems, and it was equipped with the most advanced shielding technology available. "It's impressive," Harris said, nodding appreciatively. "But will it be enough?" Graves sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "We hope so. But we won't know for sure until we put it to the test. That's where you come in." Harris looked up, meeting Graves's gaze. "You want me to command it?" Graves nodded. "You're the best we have, Harris. You've faced the Devourers before, and you've survived. You know their tactics, their weaknesses. You're the best chance we have of stopping them." Harris was silent for a moment, considering the offer. It was a daunting responsibility, one that could very well determine the fate of the entire galaxy. But he knew that he couldn't say no. He had a duty, not just to humanity, but to the countless other species that called the galaxy home. He had to do everything in his power to stop the Devourers. "I'll do it," Harris said, his voice firm with resolve. Graves smiled, clapping Harris on the shoulder. I knew I could count on you. The ship is almost ready. It just needs a name. Harris thought for a moment, then a small smile tugged at the corner of his lips. The USS Black Star. Graves nodded approvingly. A fitting name. I'll see to it that the name is added to the ship's registry. In the meantime, get some rest. You've earned it. Harris left the briefing room, his mind racing with thoughts of the battles to come. The USS Black Star would be their best hope, their last line of defense against the Devourers. But even as he thought about the ship, there was a nagging sense of unease that he couldn't shake. The Devourers were unlike any enemy they had ever faced. They were relentless, adaptable, and utterly ruthless. And Harris knew that the next time they met, it would be a battle for the very survival of the galaxy. Over the next few weeks, Harris and his crew worked tirelessly to prepare the Black Star for its maiden voyage. The ship was a marvel of engineering, equipped with the latest in human technology, and designed to be a match for anything the Devourers could throw at them. But as they ran through simulations and drills, Harris couldn't help but feel a sense of dread. The Devourers were out there watching, waiting for their next opportunity to strike. And when they did, they would bring with them a force of unimaginable power. The day of the Black Star's launch arrived, and Harris stood on the bridge, his eyes fixed on the view screen as the ship's engines roared to life. The ship lifted off the ground, its sleek hull cutting through the atmosphere as it ascended into space. The crew worked with precision, their hands moving across the controls as they guided the ship towards its destination. Their mission was clear: to find the Devourers, to track them down, and to eliminate them before they could launch another attack on the galaxy. It was a daunting task, one that would take them